How many are from the private sector in here by a show of hands? And how many are from government like me by a show of hands? Good. I would like to encourage you to participate actively in the conversation, and so that we get as much as possible from our interactions. Thank you for joining us. This is what we need, really. We need this discussion for us to bring implementation on the ground. It's not even an issue to hide. We need the private sector to invest in landscape restoration. Public funds are never going to be enough, especially in Africa, where we have all these interactions that happen between agricultural production and natural resources management. Currently, only for us to achieve the 100 million hectares in Africa, we will need $5 billion each year. That's not a small amount of money, and African governments do not have those amounts to invest. So governments in Africa have to create the environment that will enable the private sector to invest where we need landscapes to be restored. We have an interesting panel that will share with us their experiences from government, from private sector. We'll look at how a jurisdictional approach is working in Ivory Coast to encourage the private sector to invest. And of course, we'll hear from a private sector company that has invested in Ivory Coast in one region, and then we'll try to see how we learn from that. And of course, the private sector in here, let's hear your interests. What are your interests? What will motivate you to invest in landscape restoration? And then what is it that both sides are expecting? What are you expecting from government? What is government expecting from the private sector as we invest in landscape restoration? One thing we always have to remember is the fact that for us to sustainably restore landscapes, each interested party, that includes the private sector, communities, government, each one of us will have to see benefits at the end of the day. And that's the only way we're going to achieve this. So let us engage in the discussion. We have cards, we have pieces of paper that will pass along for you to note your questions that we'll ask after our panelists have shared their experiences. We encourage at least each one of you should have either a comment, a suggestion, or a question that we'll look at the end of the day. We have an amount of time that should allow us to do that. Before we go further, we have Bernard Worm from the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development in Germany, BMZ. He will start off the discussion with a welcome remarks. So let's listen attentively. It will lay the background for our discussion. Welcome, Bernard.
Thank you very much. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear distinguished guests at the expert panel. The Global Landscapes Forum is a place for exchange and discussing ideas on sustainable landscapes. When it comes to landscape approaches, the BMZ, the ministry I am from, is putting special attention to the connection between forests, landscapes, and agriculture. That's a reason why we also put agriculture and forests together in the Department for Rural Development. As we are all aware, growing populations, forests and forest landscapes, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, are increasingly threatened by deforestation and forest degradation. The continent with the highest forest loss has been Africa. 14.2 million hectares have been cleared between 2010 and 2015. The continent, the forest is covered into agricultural land. For example, between 1988 and 2007, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana lost 2.3 million hectares of forest to cocoa cultivation. So before we convert land into agricultural, forest into agricultural land, we have to think twice. And we have to think about the relevant functions forests have. Forests provide food, timber, fiber, and fuel wood to the population. Forests retain water and store carbon. Forests provide jobs and income for the rural population. In some sub-Saharan African countries, and 80% of the households depend on forest and forest landscapes because they live in or around them. Especially when agriculture harvesting fails, forests, and here mainly fuel wood and charcoal, are important sources of income for the rural population. And they provide formal jobs to 13.2 million people in the rural areas and around 41 million jobs in the informal sector. That's a huge amount. According to the World Bank, the demand for wood is going to quadruple by 2050. So there is an urgent need, basically, to invest in forest protection, forest landscape restoration, and sustainable wood production. These investments will create more rural jobs and income and improve the living conditions of people. We from BMZ have put our attention to a kind of a forest action plan. That's our forest strategy, which we developed 2 years ago. And we base our strategy, or this forest action plan, on 3 main pillars. This is first, to protect forests. There we look very much into RED Plus and RED Early Mover programs. The second pillar is restore forests. And I think yesterday, and we talked already about the African Forest Landscape Restoration Initiative, where we engage a lot in restoration. And the third pillar is to promote deforestation-free supply chains. Together with our partners, we fulfill our international commitments from Bonn Challenge, to New York Declaration on Forests in 2014 on restoration and deforestation-free supply chains. In more than 200 projects in over 30 countries, BMZ supports projects to combine forest protection, sustainable agricultural production, and restoration objectives with a sustainable development of rural areas through improved income and employment opportunities. But we also can do so if we work with like-minded partners, with governments, civil society, and of course the private sector together. Engaging the private sector in restoring and developing sustainable landscapes not only benefits the people living in these landscapes, it also benefits the nature, and most importantly, the sustainability of the businesses and supply chains themselves. And when I talk about the private sector, I don't mean only large-scale investors or multinational enterprises. In Africa, the largest sector is basically are the smallholders. And therefore, we need to seek solutions that include this huge private sector in deforestation-free supply chains, in sustainable forest management, and forest landscape restoration. But no, whether it is small-scale or large companies, all face somehow similar challenges and compete in markets and political frameworks which actually are for rather unsustainable business practices. Yeah, there are often unequal access to financial resources. Companies need more capacity to be able to compete, and most importantly, they deal with weak institutions and weak law enforcement in countries. So the ground is not very stable, basically, for private enterprises to work in. To overcome these challenges, we developed partnerships in many countries with the private sector, with other partners, civil society, and mainly we developed it, and we have to develop even further cooperations with governments to allow to work on these weak environment and governance structures. Partnerships to develop and implement visions for sustainable landscapes through sustainable supply chains are therefore very relevant. Today, I'm very happy that we can discuss examples from Rwanda, Madagascar, Cote d'Ivoire, and Ethiopia, and I'm very keen on learning about these experiences. And I'm looking forward to your inputs and thoughts on this topic. And at the end, I would like to say thank you to my colleagues from GIZ, KfW, and IUCN for organizing this forum. And of course, to GLF and for organizing the translation. Thank you very much, and I hope we have an interesting intervention now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wom. At the beginning of his remarks, he mentioned something very important that BMZ has done, bringing the agricultural sector, bringing the agricultural programs and forestry together. Where I come from, the Ministry of Agriculture is different from the ministry that looks after forestry. And we fight all the time for resources during implementation of activities, because each one of us feel like the other is more important. What he has said really is something that we can learn from, especially if we are government. So this is something to think about. He's also put more emphasis on the relevance of the private sector. Really, we need jobs. We are talking about communities here that need to earn a living every day, and probably they're overexploiting forests or they're degrading landscapes because they have to make a living. We are talking about livelihoods here, and the private sector can be there to provide those jobs to improve the conditions of the people. He also mentioned something on population growth, that the demand for wood and food and everything else, as we know, will double up or triple up by 2050. Where I come from, I say, it doesn't always have to be a negative thing that the population is going to grow that much. If each of those individuals is able to contribute to landscape restoration, what if we have improved agricultural value chains? Then it might not be a problem that we have more people, but that's a discussion that we need to have in this room and see how best we can deal with that. The next session is another interesting session. We have 5 key experts in here that will share with us, ranging from how government are creating the enabling conditions for private sector to invest. We'll learn from Rwanda how the setting up of a green movement fund is enabling restoration there. To start off, I'll call Monsieur Ngwe to come in front. He is the Vice President of the Regional Council in San Pedro. This is in Ivory Coast. Monsieur Ngwe is in charge of coordinating and monitoring actions to promote topics regarding education, health, and sports, leisure, and the youth. Let's clap hands for him as he comes to take a seat. Our next speaker is Laurent Zidia. He's also coming from Ivory Coast. So Monsieur Ngwe is representing government, and then we have a representative from the same region who is from the private sector. And he's going to talk about what type of support they are receiving from government using a jurisdictional approach that the government has put in place to enable private sector investments. Thank you, welcome. Our next speaker is Julian, my old friend from Madagascar. He works in government, so it is his responsibility to make sure that the private sector, when they come there, they have an enabling environment. So he's going to talk about how government in Madagascar is helping and is going to support the private sector to come and invest. Thank you for joining us. We have a lady on the panel, he's working in GIZ Ethiopia. She's going to give us an example of what's happening there. There is a project they are working with farmers in world coffee production. And then we'll hear how it's working. And there are very good lessons that we'll hear from her presentation. Welcome, Heward. And then our last speaker is coming from Rwanda, Mr. Bright Intale. Bright is going to share with us Rwanda's Environment and Climate Fund, which they call FONERWA. He has been very vital in the development of that fund and is currently working on the establishment of a climate innovation center in Rwanda. Thank you very much. To start off, from Ivory Coast, as I was introducing them, Monsieur Ngwe is going to, like Julian at some point, focus on how a jurisdictional approach in San Pedro is working to enable private sector to invest. Let us hear from you. It's your floor. Please use your mics. If you don't understand French, he will use French for his presentation. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I have many things to say, but unfortunately I only have 5 minutes. I hope they'll be able to stick to the time allotted. Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, Côte d'Ivoire is a country in West Africa, and it is located between Liberia to the west and Ghana to the east. And its natural border is the Gulf of Guinea. And it is also the greatest cocoa producer in the world, and also this is, of course, the raw material that helps us to make chocolate. And San Pedro, the region that the president of this company that leads it and governs it, which I represent, is the first major cocoa export port. So you will understand, therefore, that to reflect on the future of ecosystems and on the degradation of land and forest, of course, is of great importance, and we do accord a lot of priority because the General Council of Côte d'Ivoire, of San Pedro, of course, falls under the head office in Côte d'Ivoire, and 65% of this production, of what it produces, is of agricultural origin. And if you'll allow me, I would like to show you the evolution of the degradation of the forest cover from 1990 to 2015. In 1960, Côte d'Ivoire had 16 million forest cover, and now we only have 7.5 million hectares. And in the year 2000, we only have 5 million hectares of forest, and in 2015, we have 3 million hectares. So you can understand the drastic degradation of the forest cover that took place in our country, from 7.8 to just over 2.5. Now, without making any specific comments to make, but we have to react in some way, and we are trying to have a sustainable and jurisdictional approach and an integrated type of management which is holistic of the landscape with the basic products like coffee, cocoa, palm oil, which indeed are basic products in Côte d'Ivoire and which also contribute to destroying the forest, and also in a landscape where there are some specific political limitations. The strategy is designed so as to make sure that the state or the government participates to a high percentage, including the private sector. The jurisdictional approach integrates all the various stages of all the stakeholders of the value chain: production, manufacturing, transport, storage, and consumption, etc. Therefore, it takes into account all the various speculations as well as all the associated stakeholders. Therefore, it is supposed to conduct monitoring, surveillance, and evaluation of all the data which will help us to see if we are able to attain our fixed objectives. Now, without a political will to assist us to attain a rapid impact and results, the San Pedro Regional Council, which is a decentralized community of the state, does encourage the jurisdiction approach, which brings together the private sector, the international community, the government, and therefore, in order to implement this jurisdictional partnership, the San Pedro community has signed a memorandum of understanding with the GIZ on the 15th of July 2017, and subsequently the Regional Council integrated this jurisdictional partnership in its strategic development plan and also in its land development project, which is still being worked on. And very, very recently, we convened the key actors to a meeting so that we could see if we could do capacity building to see which landscapes could be protected. And finally, we are preparing a monitoring system and early warning system on deforestation in the region of San Pedro.
And here you can see an overview of some of the models of cooperation with the private sector, our partners. Firstly, we have sustainable management of natural resources and forests with the SOGB and the partner cooperatives. Furthermore, sustainable development of cocoa through agroforestry in cooperation with Cargill and OLM in the private sector and the partner cooperatives. We have also converted the abandoned plantations into classified forests and ensured that there should be reforestation with wood ivoire and other private companies as well as state companies. And the sustainable development of cocoa is being carried out with the agroforestry in cooperation with SOGB and wood ivoire. And perhaps we will be able to come back to this at a later point during the day, but I was only given 5 minutes for my presentation. I hope I've managed to remain within those time limits. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. That's a good start. So it's working. They have managed in San Pedro, as he has presented, to bring in the company, SOGB, to help in sustainable landscape restoration in the area. One thing he mentioned when he's talking about the jurisdiction approach, as he's explained, let's not confuse it. It's the same thing to when we're talking about landscape approach. But in this case, politically, they have decided that they would want to work in a decentralized system in this particular region. And as he has mentioned in his presentation, there have been achievements with the help of the private sector and, of course, cooperatives. Now, and in case we might think that he's exaggerating, we have a representative from SOGB. It's now your turn, Monsieur Zidia, to come and share with us your experience now as a private sector working in the San Pedro region. Welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants, good morning.
Sector privé.
How has the private sector been able to assist in terms of sustainable landscape restoration? Giving you the example of San Pedro and Côte d'Ivoire. Please allow me, before I begin, to present the companies within this private sector which have committed to the preservation and protection and management of sustainable landscapes in the San Pedro region of Côte d'Ivoire. These are companies, as were mentioned before, who are working in agriculture, in cocoa, and in palm oil, as well as the forestry enterprises, amongst which SOGB which is a company which has plantations of palm oil, amongst others, and employs about 10,000 people within its concession and provides work for about 5,000 people if we include the families of the workers. SOGB is also a company which, around its concession, has more than 13 village communities from which it buys about 70% of its raw material for natural rubber. Our presentation relates to the jurisdictional approach for the private sector in the region of San Pedro, and it will be done in 4 phases. The first part, the private sector supports the jurisdictional approach through bringing together all these enterprises that we mentioned above in a regional platform to exchange experience that was initiated by the Regional Council of San Pedro for the restoration of blocks of forest and degraded landscapes, and involves agroforestry, bringing together all of the small producers. Secondly, the support of the private sector is shown through the preservation for sustainable terms for blocks of forest which are on the concessions of private owners. And as an example, SOGB, which is the company which I work for, manages in sustainable manner more than 2,000 hectares of preserved forest, and within these forest areas we noticed that these include high-value fauna and flora that require conservation. Thirdly, the support of the private sector is done through awareness raising of the village communities around who are near these agro-industrial companies so that they are able to preserve themselves the community forests that belong to these village communities. And beyond awareness raising, there are projects for conservation for residual forests, and this has taken place since 2017, and this is the case of the village of Degradation, which voluntarily decided to preserve 29 hectares of forest as well as 19 other hectares. And this is done through the assistance of cartography for the forest areas that have been decided to be protected, and the aid of an inventory of the fauna and the flora of these particular areas, assistance in setting up a simple management plan so that they're able to sustainably manage these blocks of forest. But it is also good to note that the success of these awareness-raising campaigns relies heavily on the example provided by the private sector companies, and also the fact that these companies actually do take up their responsibilities through the implementation of projects for the communities, for example, projects that allow them to have access to drinking water, the construction of, then the private sector for the restoration of landscapes is made through agroforestry projects, as Severin said earlier, as well as both at private level, but also through the communities themselves. And here we're speaking about bringing together on one piece of land, for example, for cocoa. We have the high cash crops like cocoa, but then teck and cerilla on the same piece of land. And according to this model, since 2017, we've been able to set up at village level 10 hectares last year, and this year we are coming up to 30 hectares where we are having these 2 different types of crops, and we hope in 2019 we will move up to 50 hectares where we regroup the 2 different types of crops, the high level and the low level. And I hope that I've been able to cover the theme that was given to me. I thank you very much for your attention.
A private company can go in and be able to make profits out of it, as at the same time communities are also benefiting, because as I mentioned at the beginning, that we are not going to achieve this as long as the communities are not benefiting, as long as the private sector is not getting benefits out of it. So They have created 5,000 jobs. That's not a small number in rural communities. When you also mentioned that they are buying raw material from 13 villages, that surely is contributing to improved livelihoods in these homesteads. We are now going to go to Madagascar. We have heard from Ivory Coast, the government side, where they have this jurisdictional approach. I know, Julian, you are the focal point of referral in Madagascar, so you are there at the national central government now looking at how you are going to create enabling conditions for the private sector in Madagascar. Let's hear from you on how you are going to support that process in Madagascar. Thank you.
Merci, Madame la Facilitatrice.
Thank you very much, Madam Facilitator. Ladies and gentlemen, and very dear friends and guests, as I only have 5 minutes, I will go straight to the heart of the subject. The private sector is very important in terms of landscape recovery. And as we look at the landscape issues, we notice that there needs to be a proper organogram for how this space could be properly utilized in Madagascar. As an example, we have been working with different categories of partners in the private sector, from the simple peasant using charcoal, and then the private sector who are able to reforest, and those who are producing wood for furniture, and the producers who are working with cassava. As far as restoration of the landscape is concerned, we require the input of the private sector and the support of the government in order to have functional governance, in order to achieve the objectives for restoration that have been set. In fact, from a technical point of view, very often the technical package that's brought to us by the private sector is non-negligible. It's significant. And in terms of the promotion of value chains that are targeting the economic value, but often this is to the detriment of the ecological needs. From a governance point of view, locally, the private sector is a watershed between the local population and the government in terms of carrying out activities for restoration of the landscapes. And this is through the voluntary concept of the responsibility of the companies themselves, even if this concept is still at the embryonic stage. Apart from the creation of jobs for local populations, the private companies participate in activities for development, such as the construction of infrastructure, as our private company friends mentioned earlier. We must also recall the fact that the future of restoration matters in the long term will depend on the full involvement of the local community, which should be both at the same time the managers and the beneficiaries of the ecologic benefits from the restoration of the landscape. From the financial point of view, this is not the least of our concerns. Thanks to the flow of investment, the contribution of the private sector in the scale work through the promotion of their value chains is very significant in the restructuring of the architecture for financing for the working to scale on restoration of landscapes. And here, as an illustration, the project of the restoration of the reforestation that I was mentioning earlier on is being undergone through the plantation of new species, new wood species, Cankina being one of them, and this is with the integration of new partners and associates within its group. To tell you the truth, there is a reversal of roles. It's now the government watching the progress of the private companies in this initiative. The objective of the involvement of the private sector lies on the involvement of their technical know-how, so they're able to quickly start up the restoration activities, and their role with the local population for the mobilization of the local population en masse. And they provide a needed contribution through the promotion of value chains, followed by the financial injections with the obvious economic benefits. We require the government in order to have the technical framework and to guide these contributions in the implementation of the strategy for restoration. For Madagascar, the involvement of the private sector is done from the beginning of the process by integrating at the national committee level that's piloting the implementation of the hectares to be restored, and the involvement of the private sector from the initial stage is most important so that they're impregnated with the concept of the need to restore the landscape, and at the same time the possibilities of sharing risks in terms of investment. And therefore there are new value chains which are set out, which will contribute to the moulding of the management of the landscape so that these landscapes are able to carry out their multiple ecosystem vocations and create a favorable climate for this, contributing to the national strategy. And in this way, the Malagasy government, through the Forestry Ministry, works closely with the Ministry for Urban Development so that we're able to set up an adapted framework which is adapted to the requirement for the extension of the activities for reforestation, an initiative that is carried out by the relevant policies which are supported by the indefatigable support of the German company. The greatest challenges for our private partners relate to the characteristics of the activities relating to restoration, which are on a grand scale and over the long term. The complexity of this requires the coordination of various different stakeholders. And the greatest challenge lies with government to be able to set up the relevant synergies between the different partners for the implementation of the declared commitment and make practical the theory of multi-sectoral approaches to create initiatives which often fall to the private sector. For Madagascar, the National Committee plays the principal role to make this concept become a reality. And this is once again the German cooperation company which is supporting this structure. And we would like to thank you once again for that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Julian. He has made a few points that are really worth noting. You've mentioned the need, you've put emphasis on coordination. We have several players. We're talking about value chains that will need input from private sector, government, communities. You have given us an example of a national committee that includes various stakeholders, and for sure this should help move forward the movement. You've talked about synergies. This cannot be highlighted any further, because as much as we have, as different organizations, as much as we have different objectives, at the end of the day, we are all working for the same goal, to improve landscapes, to end up with sustainable landscapes, and of course to have communities that are self-sufficient and have improved livelihoods at the end of the day. Thank you very much for your contribution to the discussion. Our next speaker is Hiwet, and she's working in Ethiopia for a GIZ program there. And she's coming to share with us the lessons that have been learned so far through the program on wild coffee and how community empowerment, capacity development will help us to get there. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Facilitator. Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm pleased to share you our experience from Ethiopia on wild coffee, which is a partnership between a private and a development cooperative in promoting wild coffee from the Biosphere Reserve in Ethiopia. This partnership is called Develop PPP. We call it Develop PPP in GIZ, and it is initiative from the Federal German Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, financed by this ministry called BMZ. And in this partnership, in this developed partnership, usually the partners involved are development cooperation organization and a private sector. In this particular case, the development organization is GIZ, in Ethiopia Biodiversity and Forestry Program, and the private sector is an European company called Organic Food. And the ultimate goal of this partnership is to promote sustainable production, sustainable management of the natural resource, in this particular case, the biosphere reserve, because this wild coffee is collected from the biosphere reserve. And the other actually it has three objectives. One is a sustainable management of the biosphere reserve, and the second is creating a sustainable production value chain for the private sector, and the third is to benefit the local community producers in getting the ultimate benefit, the ultimate economic benefit from the production. And that's it. And in this partnership, so far what has been achieved is that in terms of the ecological management of the biosphere reserve, this forest is mainly managed by participatory forest management groups. These are social groups organized by the local, like an organization of local groups which are entitled to use the forest and also to manage it sustainably. So the collectors, the collector cooperatives are part of this group, these forest management groups, and what in this partnership, what has been so far done in the management of this biosphere is that these participatory forest management groups, which are entitled for the management and the use of the forests, are capacitated, and through creating a business partnership with private partner, a direct business partnership with a private company in Europe, these producers are getting a premium value for their products, which is a plus benefit for them and also a plus incentive for them to manage the forest, not to convert it or not to convert, or not to intensify the forest, because the premium value is attached to the wilderness of the product. So to maintain the wilderness, they have to maintain the forest and the entire ecological sustainability, and through that they can get the plus value of the premium from their sale. And coming to the cooperatives are capacitated in various forms, and they are certified, which is a new thing for these producers, certified in wild organic and certified in fair trade, so that they can sell their products in Europe and they can get a premium value for their products. In coming to the unions, the achievement so far on the union level is that these unions, supplying their product for the European market, do through the process have developed their production management and also handling system. Because earlier I have said that they have gone through certification of different types, and under the certification process, they had to go through a lot of improvements on their processing, packaging, handling, and so on. So, and they also have, through all these processes, they also have developed they have developed power, and they have increased their bargaining power for selling their products in higher price, and also they are being able to get loans from credit facilities and so on. Yeah. So, all these achievements have not been gained without any obstacle and any ups and downs. There have been some challenges experienced through the process. One of the challenges were the fluctuation of production volume and also production quality. Still, there has been a lot of capacity building, a lot of facility improvement, but still there are issues of qualities and volume of production. Because in wild coffee, the difference between garden coffee and wild coffee is that in garden coffee, since it is very much intensified within a small portion of land, they can produce a higher volume of production. But in wild coffee, since the trees are very much dispersed and the canopy is somehow closed, so the productivity is very low. So the volume of product that they bring to the market is also reduced. The other problem is grading of the coffee. Usually these cooperatives do not have the experience of grading based on quality-based grading. So this is their first experience, so it has costed a lot to teach them and to bring them to a level that they have to do a critical grading and quality criteria separation. As I have said earlier, these garden coffees do have a higher volume of production, so there is a tendency of shifting from production of wild coffee to more of a garden coffee, because even in the local market, coffee has a higher value. So even if they are not bringing their product for the European market, they are guaranteed that they will get the market at local level. So this is a bit of a problem to bring them on board. Delay in the export process and the bureaucracies along all the processes of production up to the export level is also one of the hassles which are experienced through the process. The lessons learned so far in the program is that I have said that these cooperatives are certified, but since they do not have this culture of producing high quality product, still there is a struggle to keep them moving, to keep them on track on following the procedures and the regulations to maintain their certification. And again, we have learned through the process that forest or natural resource conservation cannot be maintained by 2 or 3 partners. It is an issue of different stakeholders. So the involvement of different stakeholders in all levels, in all line of direction should be guaranteed in order to maintain the sustainability of the sustainability of the value chain, as well as the sustainability of the natural resource. Another lesson from the process is that usually these cooperatives are rural people who do not have a lot of knowledge about legal system. So incorporation of legal procedures and legal aspects in the whole aspect of the process is a fundamental issue to maintain the partnership, because otherwise the partnership between this private sector and the involvement of community might be in question. Thank you very much. I think I have kept the 5 minutes. If you have still questions, if you have questions, I'll be happy to respond them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Hewitt. She has brought up another important fact that even smaller entrepreneurs have to be considered as private sector in this case, because we might always think that when we're talking about private sector engagement, we are talking about big corporations, big international companies, but she has given us an example of farmers that are able to find markets in European countries where they can sell their coffee for them to get benefits out of restoration. One other thing that she has highlighted is the fact that there will be risks. There will be risks attached to the investment that we'll be making to landscape restoration. It doesn't always mean that because communities are able to get benefits out of sustainable land management or landscape restoration, that then the forest degradation will stop. She has mentioned it, that it's still happening. They are having challenges despite all these gains that communities are able to make, wild coffee farmers are able to make, they still continued forest degradation. So I think that's something that we'll have to consider and probably find solutions for. Our last speaker from the panel is Bright. He's coming from Rwanda, and he's going to share with us about inclusive finance. He will define what inclusive finance is, and of course also share with us how FONERWA, the fund that they have in Rwanda, its instruments and mechanisms are supporting inclusive finance. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. So basically today I'll be sharing the experience of FONERWA in terms of how we actually support climate action on the ground. So I'll be talking about money. I believe my colleagues are basically into policy and implementation, but this time I'll be providing a perspective of a national fund in terms of how you can actually provide funding for climate action and actually bring the private sector on board. So FONERWA is a national fund established by Cabinet in 2012, and we're basically put in place to implement the Green Growth and Climate Resilience Strategy, which is a 50-year strategy for Rwanda in terms of how we approach economic development, but also taking climate change into consideration. So our mandate is basically to coordinate climate finance in the country, but also facilitate access to international climate finance. Next slide, please. So in terms of capitalization, we're currently capitalized to a tune of $108 million. And we received funding from GCF. We have some funding from KFW. And for KFW in particular, it's earmarked for local government. So we have around 13 districts currently doing implementation on the ground, and all of them at least have a component on landscape restoration. We have funding from DFID, funding from the government itself. Next slide, please. So in terms of the design features of the fund, I'll basically be talking about the funding sources, thematic financing windows. So basically, we do not support everything. We have 4 windows, and some of the instruments in terms of how we actually support climate action on the ground. So in the first column, you can see that those are the funding sources. So we have some internal sources, and under internal sources, we actually receive funding from the Treasury itself. We collect environmental fines and fees, concessions for mining. Whenever they pay a fee for a concession, it comes to FONERA. For international or external climate funds, we target basically multilaterals and bilaterals. In terms of what we support, we have 4 thematic windows, and the first one is around conservation and sustainable management of landscapes. Window 2 is around energy, R&D, and that's specifically for the private sector. The third window is around environment and climate change mainstreaming, so that's within policy, but also programs from the different priority sectors. And the last one is around environmental impact assessment. So this one was basically put in place to deal with legacy issues. Miners come, they degrade the landscape and leave. So this window is basically put in place to support a restoration after mining. And when it comes to instruments, I believe this would be actually the right time I say something about inclusive finance and how we see it as a fund. So I won't go with a textbook definition, but how we define inclusive finance at FONERA is basically having a relationship, a formal relationship with the bottom of the pyramid. So these are basically communities or smallholder farmers, and designing instruments that respond to their needs, but also put in place tools that makes it easy for them to access funding. So for instance, when you look at a commercial bank, they have some tools they design for farmers basically, but they're not very easy. It's hard for them to access, so we try to make it easier for farmers to actually access funding through FONERA. And in terms of the instruments we have, we basically support the public sector, private sector, and civil society organization. So for the public sector and civil society, we provide grants of between $50,000 and a cap of $2 million. For the private sector, we have 2 instruments. So we have currently the innovation grant, and this is capped at $300,000, and it's basically to support R&D, proof of concept, and demonstration. However, we also have another instrument for the private sector, which is around loans, but these are subsidized loans. Currently in Rwanda, if you borrow in a commercial bank, the interest is around 18%, and that's like base. So if they add their fees and everything, it goes to 24%. And for a sector like this, it becomes unviable for the private sector to actually do anything. Like, it's not profitable for us to borrow from commercial banks. So what we've done is that we've come up with this instrument, and they can borrow at 11.45%. So that way there's a bit of, they can make at least some profit. And going into the future, we're actually thinking about creating other things to support the private sector, things like loan guarantees, viability gap funding, and last but not least, we're actually thinking of even coming up with other instruments for resource mobilization, like issuing green bonds. So in terms of the mechanism itself, we do call for proposals every quarter. So we've been operating as a demand-led fund, whereby every quarter we launch a call for proposal, and it's competitive. So whoever is interested will submit a proposal, it will be assessed, and if successful, funding provided. But that's basically for the civil society and private sector. For government, it's programmatic in nature. So we already have strategies, we already know what needs to be done by the government. So we actually help institutions design programs and provide funding for that. So in terms of funding itself, so 45% actually goes towards the demand-led fund, which is for the private sector and civil society, and 55% for the programmatic. However, even for the programmatic itself, for instance, we've designed the SPCR, which is the Sustainable Program for Climate Resilience, and this was approved by the Climate Investment Funds in December, and it's around $600 million. So we're in the process of actually mobilizing resources for that, but we cannot do that from the normal sources of funding. We're not going to look at the GCF or donor money. So private sector actually has to play a big role in terms of implementing the SPCR. We have the forestry investment program, which is around $120 million. Again, 80% of that is going to come from the private sector. And together with IUCN, we've designed, we're going to implement a project together, which is actually going to pilot one of the Global Lab instruments, which is called Climate Smart Lending Platform. So this platform is basically around supporting smallholder farmers access small loans for them to do restoration. So it's a project that will start hopefully in January this year, and we want to pilot how you can actually provide small grants and loans directly to farmers, not going through cooperatives, but smallholder farmers, but also again working with microfinance institutions and also creating an instrument around climate insurance. So I believe that's all I had for now, and thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Bright. Rwanda has really made a lot of progress in how they intend to finance landscape restoration in their country. And really, there's a lot more that as countries we can learn from what you have done, making it possible for various stakeholders to have access to funds. It's not easy for government to set up a fund. We have a fund in my country, in Malawi, Forest Development and Management Fund, but the private sector does not have access to it. But for you, you have set up mechanisms for the private sector to have access to funds, and I think that's one thing that probably will increase the motivation of the private sector to continue engaging. He also mentioned sustainable financing. The 100 million hectares, every other African country, when they are talking about their target, they always say, it's an ambitious target, it's an ambitious target. Yes, we are calling them ambitious. That word always gets tied to the targets because we really don't have an idea where the money is going to come from. So when we talk about sustainable financing, it's really something that has to be considered. We have made the commitments. Now implementation has to be done. We need to plan for where the money is going to come from for us to achieve the targets that we have committed to. We have kept you silent for too long. I'm sure there are comments, there are suggestions, and there are questions that you would like to bring on the table for us to consider. One thing I would like to say before we go into that is the fact that these degraded landscapes that we have in all these countries in Africa have really presented as an opportunity for investment for both government and the private sector. And that's why we are having this forum, this discussion in here today to ensure that we all understand our role and we all see these opportunities that are available in these various countries for investment. At first, allow me to take suggestions and comments before we go into questions. Yes, there?
Hi, thanks. I'm Steve Ball from FSC. So it's kind of suggestion, and you could turn it into question later on. I was particularly struck by one of the conclusions from Hiwot's presentation around the challenges for private sector dealing with multiple government regulators and agencies. And therefore I'm sort of interested to what extent, both in Ethiopia but elsewhere, governments have looked at setting up streamlined options that are less scary to the private sector and easier for them to manage. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's get another, Hiwot, take note. We will consider it as a question somehow. You can give some kind of clarification. Yes, sir?
Yeah, thank you. Nigel Sizer with Rainforest Alliance. Just building on this fantastic panel here, I just want to mention we have a panel at 4 o'clock this afternoon in the tent on supply chains and forest and landscape restoration, which really complements and builds on a lot of what we've been discussing here this morning. An area that we really struggle with and are very concerned about in our work with tea, coffee and cocoa farmers across Africa is is reaching out beyond sort of the core certification standards and the farmer engagement to the wider landscape, and ensuring that you start to incentivize those wider landscape changes. So I'd be interested in hearing a bit more about how you're looking at that, and within that, how you're ensuring that you get to the most vulnerable smallholders and the women farmers in particular, where we see tremendous opportunities for much greater gains and contributions. Thank you.
Keep on specializing. Yes, for us to move forward, really, we need that. And then also talking about the most vulnerable, the ROM assessments that our countries have been engaging in, for us to identify these degraded areas, have really helped us identify those areas where our interventions are most needed. For example, in Malawi, we have an idea of where these most vulnerable communities are and what interventions that they're looking for, and how in each of the investments that are going to be made in landscape research can help to do that. Thank you for those interventions. A hand there.
Yeah, let me steer the discussion a little bit. I'm a bit concerned we are lacking some critical thinking and arguing about the cases presented. And let me pick the Ivory Coast example, the SOGP. We were hearing that they're interested in sustainability and promoting sustainable use, but as I understand it, this is a oil palm and rubber producing company with thousands and thousands of hectares under these monocultures. Then the gentleman was mentioning they are protecting 29 hectares of forest. So what's the correlation between protection and expansion of monocultures? And do we think that oil palm plantation is put in place is a successful restoration? Does that count as a sustainable landscape? What are the indicators, the criteria, the independent monitoring, the verification? We heard about the certification. Is this job creation at all costs? Or are there smarter solutions than monoculture only? So these are a few questions.
Thank you very much. We have taken note of that and we'll address them. But one thing that I would want to mention right away is the fact that it depends. There will be some areas where monocultures will contribute, and they might not always have to be wrong or right. I'll give an example of Malawi, where we have government plantations that are over 100,000 hectares. We have monocultures on those plantations, and private companies are investing in restoring those plantations where we have monocultures. And we have government representatives here, and of course the private company itself. They will have, I'm sure they will have something to say themselves on how they are monitoring this, and then even the criteria that you talked about. Is there, okay, another hand there?
Yes, this is Xue from C4. I would like to follow up on the last question. I think it will be easier if I just ask now. So in Uganda, where we are working, there is a sugarcane company that's talking about conserving forests in concentrated community areas, like what SOGB was talking about, but at the same time, the expansion linked to their outgrower scheme and the forest clearance from it is very severe. So I'm wondering for SOGB, you talked about 70% of your raw materials coming from outgrowers. What are your environmental safeguards for your outgrowers, whether it's palm oil or rubber? And do you look at that as a way of restoring and scaling up your environmental efforts rather than concentrating on small budgets? Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe before we take any more questions, unless you have a suggestion, because I've noticed that we are now getting questions and not only suggestions and comments. Are those suggestions, okay. I will only take suggestions and comments because yes, we have noted the questions, but let's take suggestions and comments first. Your hand, sir.
Thank you. Ben Sihanya, University of Nairobi Law School. My main comments and recommendation is that in a lot of these issues, we do a value chain analysis that is based on value addition and identify the various innovations and the applicable intellectual property rights that apply. For instance, questions of coffee, there are issues of the biological diversity issues and plant breeders' rights, traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions, and of course, also geographical indication and even trademark or branding issues. So as long as we omit the intellectual property and innovation questions, then it becomes that we are just exporting or dealing with natural products without sufficient value addition and without getting the related resources from these processes. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Jeff Campbell from the Forest and Farm Facility. I really appreciate the inclusion of small scale producers within the private sector. This has too long been a gap, and the discussions have focused very much on large scale private sector. But what I wanted to emphasize is how to really better institutionalizing business capacity building. Because right now we have wonderful models of particular partnerships, good pilots, but what we want to do is institutionalize the scaling up of this. One thing we have been thinking much more seriously about is really building long-term incubation, business incubation and coaching capacity within federations of producer organizations, for instance. There are many different ways to do that. Incentivizing savings and loans with matching funds. The Rwanda case seemed to have a very interesting array of possibilities. But the final point I wanted to make is if we move down in our understanding, we have found through experience that internal value chain investment is often the best. That is, investment by companies higher up in value chains to producers and partner businesses lower down offers much more immediate, often, traction for those investors. They see the benefit. They're getting their supply is increasing for their upward marketing. And my final point is if we're talking about linking this value chain approach to landscape restoration, we need to talk about basket of products. That is, how can we create more like multi-purpose cooperatives or organizations that are using these denomination of origin or landscape branding, etc., that was just mentioned, to be pushing a basket of products, not using the old single product approach for restoration and landscape-based production. So I think these are just some additional thoughts which would be good to get a discussion of.
We need indeed to institutionalize business capacity building within the communities, the small entrepreneurs. We can't always rely on projects. Projects come and go, but we should be able to continue to do that even without specific project in specific regions. Is that a comment? I'll take a last comment and then 2 questions to add to the others that have already been asked. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Oscar Simanto from Kenya Forest Service. I think the Rwandan case of lending for climate action at the local level is quite interesting. In Kenya, the Kenya Forest Service is piloting what we call the Forest Investment Facility. And the Forest Investment Facility, we wanted to, our aim was to disapprove the notion by the private sector that it is too risky to lend to smallholder farmers, to small community groups. And what we have done is that we have a loan portfolio in which we are lending what we call low interest loans to households and small community groups. We are actually building evidence for that. And the most interesting thing is that we build capacity for those small groups and households on financial literacy. We are working with a private bank on the same, and we are getting very, very positive results. In that there is absorption of the loans, and the communities and the households are able to repay the loans. We are actually getting up to 80 to 90% repayment rates. So I think there are many things we can share. And what I think is that in order for us to lend, because I was involved in a study to look at lending, especially to forest enterprises and smallholder farmers. Africa is ranking very, very low, and the private sector, the private banks are not lending, financiers are not lending to smallholder farmers, maybe 20 to 30%. That's the rate we have across the continent. So we have to change this narrative.
2 seconds.
We have to change this narrative by using these lessons that we can lend to the smallholder farmers who are the biggest private sector scattered across the continent.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you, thank you. We are running out of time. It's an interesting discussion, yes, but allow me to stop it, the comments and suggestions section there, and then get, I think I'll get 2 questions now. Only 2, if not even 1. Yes, madam.
Hello. It's not working. Oh, great. My name is Tasila Banda. I am with the Zambia Integrated Forest Landscape Program, under which one of the components is the development of enterprises in agriculture. And it was very interesting to see the coffee example from Ethiopia. What would have been very helpful for me is to understand or hear a little bit more of what the price differences were between the basic pricing and the premium price that is received when coffee gets to the European market, and also to see that improvement on the income levels of the unions of the private sector that are involved. I might have missed it, but you'll be interested to see some of the data coming out of these value chains.
Thank you very much. Before I take another question, let me allow our speakers to respond to some of these, and then if there will be any more time remaining, we'll get back to taking other questions. There was an intervention for requiring a response from Ivory Coast, where he's asking, what about monocultures? What are we doing about that? And then looking at the jobs that we are creating, how is that happening? I will give you 1 minute or 1.5 minutes to give a response to that. And then, Hewitt, you also have a few clarifications to make from the floor. It's your time. Let's start with.
Thank you. What we must bear in mind is that in the San Pedro region in Côte d'Ivoire, the expansion of crops relating to palm oil are not done at the same pace. As an example, in the 1980s, or around 1983, around the SOCGB concession, we only had about 100 producers of air. Now we have more than 20,000 producers of this product. The expansion is done exponentially, and this was justified by the fact that the smallholders derive income from cultivating this crop. Now, in figures, SOGB uses 16,000 hectares to grow this crop, and about 8,000 hectares for growing palm oil. And as far as the smallholders are concerned, there are no longer any arable and land which is cultivated. The only land that can be cultivated at the village level is land which we would wish to preserve in order to promote a community forest there. But we help the smallholders in order to help them to optimize the yields on the cultivated services. Now, whether we are talking about palm oil olivier, we encourage them to to organize agricultural associations and also to try and plant these crops within the forest areas in order to achieve 0% of deforestation. Namely, they would be growing these two crops, but we help them to improve their yields and also to include in their plots some forest planting in order to bring about diversification. And this is how we help them in terms of diversifying their crops and to optimize the produce in general.
Thank you for that. I hope he has clarified a few of the issues that you had. Hewitt, let me give you a chance now to respond.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the question. The gentleman here have asked about government strategy in streaming the private sector. In the country, on the paper, there are some conditions which are attractive for the private investors. However, on the ground, that's what I wanted to say to mention with regard to the bureaucracy. On the ground, there are some problems, like the problems usually are either the policies, the different policies contradict each other, or the different offices or ministries do not read each other. So usually this misunderstanding and contradicting issues in the different policies, guidelines, rules and regulations are one of the hassles which creates the bureaucracies. So like in general, in umbrella, there are some favorable conditions, but still on the implementation and on the realization, the system is not very clear and smooth. That's what I can say. And regarding the question here from the lady about the price difference, I might not be able to tell you the exact price difference, but what we have obtained from the program is that there has been 21% increase in the economical return by these cooperatives engaged in this partnership. So there has been an increase, about 21%, but the exact figure of the price, maybe I have to go through the document, and maybe we can later on discuss about that after the discussion here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Because of time, we will not be able to take any more questions, but allow me to just say that our speakers here have shared with us the experiences of the jurisdictional approach and how it is promoting landscape restoration, and of course the need that government has to create an enabling environment for private sector to be able to invest. We have also discussed the inclusion of both big and small entrepreneurs or private sector players in landscape restoration. This is very important. And of course, when we talked about inclusive financing, farmers can be trusted with loans. That's what we have heard during this discussion. I would like to ask that we continue. Let this discussion not end in here. There are country representatives here, there are private sector representatives in here. Let us continue this discussion, and hopefully next year when we come to a similar meeting, we'll hear that I invested in Madagascar, I invested in Rwanda because of this discussion that we had. I would like to also say thank you to GIZ and KFW on behalf of BMZ, and of course my great partner in this, IUCN, for putting together this session for us to have an opportunity to learn from what is happening in Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Madagascar on how we can really bring the private sector on board to implement FLR and achieve the 100,000 hectares that we have pledged in our various countries. And lastly, thank you as our audience, as our partners in this discussion, for making yourselves available to join us in this forum. Thank you very much.